I'm going to start off here with a rumor. You can't use rumors as evidence in a courtroom, but this is not a courtroom. This is from the HSCA. Investigators went to Dallas, and they wrote, "We then proceeded to the Pate garage located in the back rear of El Chico's on 7th Street. This is just a few blocks south of 1026 Beckley. Mr. Pate was extremely reluctant to talk to us. He indicated the entire thing was somewhat of an inside joke as far as the business community of Dallas is concerned, and that they all know, it's common knowledge, that there's a Ruby-Tippit-Oswald conspiracy, had been from the very beginning." And this is what I think. There was a Ruby-Tippit-Oswald conspiracy. And according to Mac Pate, the business community of Dallas thought so too. Then we have this letter from J. Edgar Hoover, Director of the FBI, to the Honorable J. Lee Rankin, General Counsel of the Warren Commission. And the first paragraph: "Dear Mr. Rankin, reference is made to my letter dated March 30th, 1964, furnishing you with the results of our inquiry into the allegation of Mark Lane before the President's Commission. Lane stated that a week prior to the assassination of President Kennedy, a meeting took place at the Carousel Club in Dallas, Texas, which was attended by Mr. Bernard Weissman, Dallas Police Officer J.D. Tippit, and Mr. Jack Ruby." And the Warren Commission questioned Jack Ruby about this. Mr. Rankin says, "There was a story that you were seen sitting in your Carousel Club with Mr. Weissman, Officer Tippit, and another who has been called a rich oil man at one time shortly before the assassination. Can you tell us anything about that? Who was the rich oil man? Can you remember? We haven't been told. We are just trying to find out anything that you know about him. I am the one that made such a big issue of Bernard Weissman's ad. Maybe you do things to cover up, if you are capable of doing it. As a matter of fact, Saturday afternoon we went over to the Turf Bar Lounge, and it was a whole hullabaloo, and I showed the pictures of Impeach Earl Warren to Bellaccio, and he saw the pictures and got very emotional, and Bellaccio said, 'Why did the newspaper take this ad of Weissman?' And Bellaccio said, 'I have got to leave Dallas.' And suddenly, after making that statement, I realized it is his incapability, and suddenly you do things impulsively, and suddenly you realize if you love the city, you stay here, and you make the best of it. And there were witnesses. I said the city was good enough for you all before this. Now you feel that way about it.' And that was Bellaccio. As far as Tippit, it is not Tippit's. It is not Tippit's. It is Tippit. This Weissman and the rich oil man, did you ever have a conversation with them?" "There was only a few. Bill Rudman from the YMCA, and I haven't seen him in years. And there is a Bill Howard, but he is not a rich oil man. He owns the Stork Club now. He used to dabble in oil." "Chief Justice Warren, this story was given by a lawyer by the name of Mark Lane, who is representing Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, and it was in the paper, so we subpoenaed him, and he testified that someone had given him information to the effect that a week or two before President Kennedy was assassinated, that in your Carousel Club, you and Weissman and Tippit, Officer Tippit, the one who was killed, and a rich oil man had an interview or conversation for an hour or two. And we asked him who it was that told him, and he said that it was a confidential, and he couldn't tell at the moment, but that he would find out for us if whether he could be released or not from his confidential relationship. He has never done it, and we have written him several letters asking him to disclose the name of that person, and he has never complied. Isn't that foolish? If a man is patriotic enough in the first place, who am I to be concerned if he wasn't an informer? I am incarcerated, nothing to be worried about anyone hurting me. Chief Justice Warren, Mr. Ruby, I am not questioning your story at all. I wanted you to know the background of this thing and to know that it was with us only hearsay. But I did feel that our record should show that we would ask you the question and that you would answer it. And you have answered it. So Ruby never says that he met with J.D. Tippit, and I believe he denies it ever knowing J.D. Tippit somewhere. But his answers are so squirrely that it makes me wonder whether he's telling the full truth or not. Anyway, back to the Hoover letter here. On March 26, 1964, a confidential source of our New York office, who has furnished reliable information in the past, advised that Vincent Theodore Lee, former director of the National Office of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, had related similar statements that President Kennedy was actually assassinated by Dallas police officer Tippit, and that 1 week before the assassination, Tippit, the head of the John Birch Society in Dallas, and an unnamed third party, possibly Oswald, were together in Jack Ruby's nightclub. Lee reportedly obtained his information from other individuals previously active in the FPCC. Lee further stated that while Oswald was an advocate of the FPCC, he had also joined a number of anti-Castro movements and was therefore in a position to know everything on both sides of the issues involved. Vincent Theodore Lee was contacted by a representative of this bureau on April 9, 1964, at which time he stated he could furnish no additional information to the FBI regarding Lee Harvey Oswald. He stated that he knew nothing of an evidentiary nature regarding stories being circulated to the effect that Patrolman Tippit of the Dallas Police Department, Jack Ruby, and the John Birch Society were involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. He stated that in his opinion the John Birch Society could have been involved, but that his opinion was based solely on his feelings and not on specific facts in his possession. Specifically, he stated he had no information concerning any meeting between Mr. Bernard Weissman, Officer Tippit, and Jack Ruby. So apparently, in the presence of an FBI informant unknown to Vincent Theodore Lee, he said that someone who was a member of the FPCC had told him that Tippit had shot Kennedy and that Tippit had met with Ruby. But when the FBI says, "Hey, we're the FBI, do you know anything about this?" he doesn't know anything about it. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that he's telling the truth to the FBI. He might have been telling the truth when he didn't realize he was talking to the FBI. And we know that Vincent T. Lee had been in communication with Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination. So there's a possibility that Oswald himself might have told Lee that he had been to a meeting in Ruby's Carousel Club with J.D. Tippit. And Lee might even have knowledge of the assassination plan prior to the day of the assassination. Of course, he never said that, but I think that's a possibility. And we have information indicating that Vincent T. Lee and Jack Ruby were both in Cuba at the same time, and it also coincides with the time that Lee Oswald, a relatively poor person, was out of town for a few days. On the left here is a CIA document that says Vincent T. Lee and Elizabeth Mora, who we won't get into in this video, but that they had both gone to Havana on December 28th, 1962. And we have information from the DRE, the group that, I forget his name, but they're an anti-Castro group, and they might have an interest in implicating Castro, whether it's true or not. Nonetheless, they did say that Ruby flew from Mexico City to Havana the latter part of December 1962 on a Mexicana de Aviación flight. And so we have an allegation, at least, that Jack Ruby was in Havana, and this is the same time that Vincent T. Lee was in Havana. And also during this period, according to a letter or a postcard written by Oswald to his brother Robert, he says he was out of town for a few days, and the implication here is a few days after Christmas, because he didn't send a thank you note for a gift that Robert had sent. So the evidence implies the possibility that Lee, Vincent T. Lee, Jack Ruby, and Lee Oswald all could have been in Cuba at the same time at the end of 1962 and the beginning of 1963. So this suggests the possibility that Vincent T. Lee knew far in advance of a plot that Oswald and Ruby were involved in, and that might make sense, therefore, that he would know of a meeting at the Carousel Club, too. I forgot where I got this document. It's written by journalist Thayer Waldo on February 10th, 1967. It looks like it probably comes from an official government document release. So my guess is that it's something that the FBI had in their possession, but that it was written by Thayer Waldo. This might come from the Garrison investigation. It has about the dimensions of the paper look like Garrison documents, and it's about the right time. But I'm not sure where it comes from. And in this document it says, while Ruby was in Cuba in 1959, at the invitation of Louis J. McWillie, a well-known Las Vegas gambler, he boasted to at least two persons, both U.S. citizens, that he was in with both sides. And that would mean, I think, with the pro and anti-Castro sides. And that would make him perfectly positioned to be a U.S. double agent. Not saying that Jack Ruby was a professional agent of any kind, but if you're in intelligence work, you can't always choose who is perfectly positioned to be your agent. And if Jack Ruby was in with both sides, he would be perfectly positioned to be an agent who could be utilized by U.S. intelligence. And I think that is what happened. Anyway, continuing here, he claimed to have close friendships with former Cuban Senator Rolando Masferrer, who operated a private army during the dictatorship of Batista, and with a man named Battisti, also an ex-senator and former owner of the Seville Biltmore Hotel. Ruby also named several other Cuban exiles whom he professed to know well. Among them were two men whose names appeared recently in published lists of those detained while readying an assault on Haiti under Masferrer's leadership. Ruby further stated at that time that I can get a personal knockdown to Castro anytime I want it from a buddy of his and mine in Texas. Robert R. McEwen of Houston told the FBI in 1964 that a man he identified as Ruby from various photographs had approached him about 1 month after Castro's takeover and offered him $25,000 for a letter of introduction to Castro. McEwen had been photographed with Castro in Houston at the time of the latter's April 1959 visit there. Although McEwen agreed to Ruby's proposition, he never heard from him again. So I'm showing this to demonstrate that Ruby could play both sides of this. That is, he could play the pro-Castro and the anti-Castro. And as I said, I think that positions him to be a perfect double agent, which I think he was. That is, I think there was a Castro plot to kill Kennedy. Oswald was part of it. Ruby was part of it. But Ruby was a double agent for American intelligence. So this doesn't prove a relationship between Ruby and Oswald, but it suggests the possibility that there was such a relationship and that it involved intelligence operations involving Cuban intelligence and U.S. intelligence. Maybe even that's might be putting it a little strongly. What it does is it shows a sketchy outline for what could have happened, and I think there's reasons to believe what did happen. That is, and in this particular video, what I'm getting at is we have this implied relationship between Oswald and Ruby and Vincent T. Lee of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And Vincent T. Lee, in a moment of presumed candor, had said that J.D. Tippit was also involved in the plot. So this evidence loosely associates all three characters, that is Ruby, Tippit, and Oswald, with a Cuban plot to kill Kennedy. Very loosely, I admit, but it's probably the best kind of evidence we're ever going to be able to find at this point. But we do have more evidence that Tippit was involved with Oswald in the Clifton Chastain evidence. That's the way I interpret it anyway. This document comes from 1950. It's an FBI document, and it shows Clifton Chastain to be an FBI informer or informant. I don't know what you'd call him technically. Not that he works for the FBI, but he was working for a defense contractor at the time, Clifton Chastain was, and he reported a fellow worker who had said some disapproving things about the Korean War or the United States' involvement with the Korean War. So, of course, he called the FBI. Those were different days than today, I think. But anyway, this shows the kind of guy Clifton Chastain is. That is, he cooperates with the authorities. And more specific to this case, we have this December 3rd, 1963 FBI document, which reports that Clifton Chastain said that Oswald had been coming into his barber shop for the previous 2 or 3 months at that time, before the assassination. And I'm starting here in the middle of the document. On occasions, upon leaving the barber shop, Chastain said that he had seen Oswald cross the street to enter Hutch's grocery store. And I include that here because we do have an FBI document relating an interview with Hutch, or Hutchison, who confirms that Oswald had been in his store. So I think that corroborates Chastain to some extent. This shop is in Irving, by the way, and Oswald will be in Irving. According to the official story, he would be in Irving on the weekends with Marina and the children. On several occasions, Chastain said that Oswald came to the shop in the company of a 14-year-old boy, whom he described as a white male, short hair, not a flat top, dark brown in color. He described him, that is, his hair is dark brown in color. He described him as a little bit freckled with brown eyes and stated he usually wore blue jeans. On one occasion, when this boy came into the shop for a haircut alone, not accompanied by Oswald, he had made some statements which had astounded Chastain. And it was for this reason that he had asked him his age, and he was told that the boy was 14. Chastain stated that the topic in the shop at the time was foreign aid, and most in the shop had agreed that the United States could not buy friends. The boy, who up to that time had had nothing to say, volunteered something to the effect that we will only be free when everyone has the same, when everyone is equal. The boy continued in this vein, Chastain said, espousing what he considered to be a communist doctrine. He said he had never been able to establish the identity of the boy and only knows that he had been associated with Oswald. So I think this boy is actually the son of J.D. Tippit, Allan Tippit, and if I'm right, then this associates Allan Tippit with a communist association. That is presumably Oswald's influence. But if Oswald is talking communism with the son of J.D. Tippit, I think that strongly suggests that J.D. Tippit himself has something to do with this communist group that is forming before our eyes here. That is Oswald, Allan Tippit, and J.D. Tippit. And it can't prove absolutely that this is J.D. Tippit's son, but I think so. Now here it says the boy had told Shastine that he was 14. Allan Tippit was born on January 1st, 1950. So at this time he was still 13. This would be in the latter part of 1963. But I think it's a reasonable possibility that a 13-year-old boy who's going to be turning 14 in 2 or 3 months would claim to be 14. I think that's a common thing, that teenage boys want to seem to be older than they actually are. So that doesn't bother me. It's not like the boy showed his birth certificate to Shastine. He just said he was 14. Now, when Shastine talked to the Warren Commission, he gave this description of the boy. Well, he had on blue jeans and they fit tight, and he had on an old striped shirt. I remember him just like I see a picture over there right now. And he was a husky kid. He wasn't what you call fat, but he was strong, broad-shouldered, had a real full, and when I say full, I don't mean a round fat face. He was a wide-faced kid. You know, he was a nice-looking kid. I mean, if he had the personality and the teaching and the understanding to go with his looks, he could have done anything he wanted to do. But his personality to me made him look terrible, and what he thought, and naturally when somebody disagrees with you to the point you get angry with them, you don't think much of their looks. But if you bring it down to his looks, he was blue-eyed, blonde-headed. He was not a light blonde. He was a dark blonde. In fact, a lot of people might call him brown-headed. In fact, Shastine himself, in the FBI document, said he was brown-headed. But he wasn't nobody's dummy, because a 14-year-old boy can't spit out. I wouldn't attempt to say just how he said everything, but the things that struck me when he belittled our country and our leaders as a whole. I might disagree with our leaders, but I'll stick up for them when it comes down to the point. And this is a photograph taken the day after the assassination, and Allan Tippit is on the far right there, contrary to the 14-year-old boy who was on the far left, apparently. That's a joke. And here I've also included the 2 descriptions given by Clifton Shastine. And in this photograph, taken the day after the assassination, Allan Tippit is wearing blue jeans, and they fit tight. He's wearing an old striped shirt, you might say. It's a jacket kind of thing. You might call it a sweater even. I don't know what you call it exactly. But it does have stripes on the shoulders. And so I think the description matches up pretty well with Allan Tippit. And since J.D. Tippit is involved with this story, he was the other guy killed other than Oswald, and the president, of course. And I think there are other indications that Tippit was involved and that Allan Tippit was involved. So I think we have a good possibility here, and I think it's correct that the Shastine 14-year-old boy is actually Allan Tippit, the son of J.D. Tippit. Now, Allan Tippit's photograph did appear in the newspaper after the assassination, or in one of the newspapers, I think. And one might think that Clifton Shastine would have seen that. Not necessarily, but of course the assassination generated a lot of interest. And I would think the people in Dallas, even or in the Dallas area, or anywhere, would be reading multiple newspapers, even if it wasn't their regular newspaper. So I would think there's a good possibility that Shastine saw Allan Tippit's picture in the newspaper, and yet he didn't come forward to identify him as the 14-year-old boy he had seen in his barber shop. And I got this here. This is from Clifton Shasteen's Warren Commission testimony. Mr. Jennis says, "Did you receive a letter from Mr. Rankin, the general counsel of the commission?" "No, the chief of police came out yesterday afternoon. He's a good friend of mine, and he came out yesterday evening and had me to call the Secret Service, Mr. Sorrells?" "Yes." It's not absolutely clear to me here whether Shasteen is saying Chief Curry is his good friend or Mr. Sorrells, Forrest Sorrells, is his good friend. But whichever way, and also in light of the 1950 FBI report I showed earlier, it seems clear to me that Mr. Clifton Shasteen considers himself a friend of the authorities and would cooperate with the authorities. And if the authorities said, "We want to keep this secret," that J.D. Tippit's son was hanging out with Oswald at the barber shop, if we want to keep that secret, I think Mr. Shasteen would have agreed to keep it secret. So even if Shasteen had recognized the 14-year-old boy in the newspaper as Allan Tippit, I think he would have kept that a secret if the authorities had wanted him to. And I think they would have wanted him to, because they wanted to sell this as a lone nut job. And if Oswald is hanging out with J.D. Tippit's son, that would be a hard sell. So I'm comfortable with my identification of the 14-year-old boy at the barber shop hanging out with Oswald. I'm comfortable that that is J.D. Tippit's son, because that's what makes sense with everything. And there's more, of course, than I've said already. And as far as I know, he hasn't been identified as anybody else. That is, nobody has come forward and done a sixth floor museum interview saying, "I'm that 14-year-old boy." The only other identification of this boy that I've ever come across is one by Greg Parker, who said it was Bill Hootkins, the actor who later went on to play a role in the Star Wars movie. Now, I think it's very odd that Greg Parker vehemently supported his identification of this boy and very dishonestly attacked my argument that it was Allan Tippit. I think it's very weird that anybody would be so committed to his interpretation, an interpretation which has no basis in fact, that he would be utterly unreasonable in his presentation and even lie, which Greg Parker did. Are you still out there, Greg Parker? I don't know, and I don't care, but I think you're a shill. I think Greg Parker is a shill, and that he attacks any truth that arises about the JFK assassination, any truth, not just this one, and that he provides, I think his role was to provide alternate explanations for the true explanations, and I think Bill Hootkins is such an alternate explanation. Greg Parker, by the way, also attacked this sighting of Oswald at the Dobbs house by Mary Ada Dowling. This is a particularly strong, particularly well-corroborated sighting of Oswald at the Dobbs house, because it matches up with Oswald being seen just after this by, what's his name? By Ralph Yates, whom Greg Parker also attempted to discredit by saying that Yates was a gay prostitute and that he had picked up Larry Crawford. I think that's what Parker said. I don't know. If you really want to know, you'll have to go ask Greg Parker about that. But anyway, Yates said he picked up Oswald on the same day that Mary Ada Dowling saw Oswald at the Dobbs house, and it would have been just after she had seen him there, and gave Oswald a ride to the Texas School Book Depository. So I think this is a particularly good sighting, particularly credible sighting of Oswald at the Dobbs house that Greg Parker had to go out of his way to attack, of course, because that's what Greg Parker did. And also cited was J.D. Tippit. Mary Ada Dowling said that Tippit was also there. She said they didn't seem to be together, that is, Tippit and Oswald didn't seem to be together, but that they were both at the Dobbs house at the same time. And this was just a few days before the assassination. So we have Oswald and Tippit hanging out, sort of, in the same diner. They're not apparently together, but they're both there. And I think Tippit was there to give Oswald a ride on this day. But that's conjecture. So we have Oswald and Tippit sighted together in the same place here, in addition to his son being sighted with Oswald, as I say. So the evidence suggests that Tippit is Oswald's friend, sort of. At least that Tippit and Oswald know each other, and that Oswald is taking Tippit's son to the barber shop on weekends. And based upon the photography, I say that Allan Tippit was in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. We have the photograph with him looking into the camera there, with sitting down with his arm on the table. That was from a news photographer taken Saturday morning, the day after the assassination. And he's wearing the same garment, jacket, or shirt, or whatever you call it, that he was wearing in Dealey Plaza. And in the upper left insert here, we can see the smaller insert in the insert is a boy that was up on the overpass. He's wearing glasses in the photograph in Dealey Plaza, but I think the glasses were probably added just to make us think it's not Allan Tippit. He's wearing the same jacket. It looks like the same hair, the same haircut, same hair combing. So I think it's Allan Tippit. And the one in the top there on the right, or in the middle, of course, the same picture from Allan Tippit sitting down, but this is from one of the films. One frame of this film shows this boy looking into the camera. And he doesn't seem to be wearing glasses in that picture. It's the same boy that ran up to the overpass that I showed over, that's on the left there. And before that is before the shooting, he was standing by the side of the road with the Chisholm family. And as I have pointed out in other videos, Allan Tippit was involved with the Chisholm family. Mrs. Chisholm had a handbag before the shooting, had a different handbag after the shooting, and the new handbag she had, I surmise, was the handbag that had the gun, the short gun that had been used behind the picket fence. And the handbags were switched, and Allan Tippit got rid of the original handbag she had. Well, she took the new handbag with the gun in it, and she took the gun away from the scene. So, the way I see it, Allan Tippit was in Dealey Plaza. He was involved with an assassination plot, and he's J.D. Tippit's son, and he was hanging out also with Oswald. So, in my view, that means J.D. Tippit was involved too. So, J.D. Tippit and Oswald were involved together in this plot. And as I pointed out, Jack Ruby also appears to be involved with this plot. And it's these intimations of this are all over the place, even if nothing can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So it looks to me as if Tippit was involved with what seems to me to have been a Cuban plot, that is, a pro-Castro plot to assassinate Kennedy. And that the implication being that Tippit was a communist or a communist sympathizer, and his son apparently was, Oswald apparently was. And so I think Tippit probably was too, but one problem with that idea is that there's no evidence whatsoever that Tippit had anything to do with communism, other than the kind of thing I've been going over here. So what I'm looking for, I guess, is in this video is the supportive intimations that Tippit could have been a communist. And there are such things. It's very tenuous, but it's there. And that tenuous connection to communism runs through his wife. Here, his wife is pictured marrying another cop of higher rank than J.D. Tippit in the Dallas police force. And you can see how thrilled Marie is just by looking at the photograph. And the thread here, the red thread here, runs through Marie Tippit's maiden name. And according to J.D. Tippit's personnel file, Marie's maiden name was Gassaway. But according to the 1940 census, the family name here is actually Gassaway. I don't mean to imply that any shenanigans are being performed here. I think it's probably just getting alternate spellings, simplified spelling, and maybe Gassaway has some implied meanings that are unpleasant. But anyway, I think it's pretty clear from the records that in 1940 at least, the family name was Gassaway, not Gassaway. And the name Gassaway, Gwyn Gassaway, does appear in FBI documents, though I can't prove that this Gassaway is related to Marie Gassaway, J.D. Tippit's wife. But Gassaway seems to be a relatively uncommon name, so I wouldn't be surprised. On December 7th, 1963, Harry McCormick of the Dallas Morning News advised the Dallas office of the FBI that in February of 1963, a friend of his, Gwyn Gassaway, 3708 Armstrong, had written a letter to the editor, which letter had been published in his paper. As a result of this letter being published, Mrs. Gassaway received an anonymous communication signed "A Worker." McCormick said on November 24th, 1963, the Dallas Morning News carried a facsimile of Lee Harvey Oswald's letter to John Connally, Secretary of the Navy. McCormick said that Mrs. Gassaway saw this facsimile letter of Oswald's in the paper and has told him she believes the handwriting in the facsimile and the handwriting in the anonymous communication she received are the same. McCormick was advised by Mrs. Gassaway that the original anonymous letter which she received had been turned over to the FBI by her in February of 1963. The anonymous communication, dated February 16, 1963, signed "A Worker," postmarked February 16, 1963, Dallas, Texas, which was previously turned over to the Dallas office by Mrs. Gassaway, was located in Dallas files and forwarded to the FBI laboratory on December 9, 1963, for comparison with the known handwriting of Lee Harvey Oswald for the purpose of determining whether the anonymous communication was or was not written by Oswald. Under date of December 11, 1963, the FBI laboratory advised as follows concerning a document examination requested by Dallas office on December 9, 1963. Specimens received 12/10/63, Q251, envelope postmarked Dallas, Texas, February 16th, 5:30 p.m., 1963, addressed to Mrs. Gwyn Gassaway, 3708 Armstrong, Dallas, Texas, and accompanying one-page handwritten letter dated 2/16/63, captioned, "Regarding your letter in the Times-Herald, 2/16, and signed, yours truly, A Worker." Result of examination. It was concluded that Q251 was not written by Lee Harvey Oswald. K4 and K5 in this case. I have not been able to find the text of this letter that had been suspected as having been written by Oswald, but this FBI document here makes reference to it and refers to the contents of the letter. And here it says, D59, letter to Mrs. Gwyn Gassaway, Q251, reported on pages 190 to 191 of 12/23/63. Letter received by Mrs. Gassaway, Dallas, Texas, dated 2/16/63, states Communism is a growing idea which cannot be stopped. Laboratory determined letter not written by Oswald, no further action. So this was a pro-communist letter written by someone calling himself a worker, apparently from Dallas, Texas. A letter to the editor in response, not a letter to the editor, a letter to Gwen Gassaway in response to her letter her letter to the editor that had been published in the newspaper, and presumably it was an anti-communism letter, though we don't get that either. But what it sounds like here is that Mrs. Gwen Gassaway wrote a letter to the editor that had been published in the newspaper that was anti-communism, and that a worker, a person apparently living in Dallas or having mailed the letter in Dallas, sent a letter to Gwen Gassaway in response to her letter to the editor, and a worker was a communist. Now I'm going to summarize this here to make it easy to understand. In February of 1963, the newspaper published what I presume to be an anti-communism letter written by Gwen Gassaway. On the same day Gassaway's letter was published, a worker writes a pro-communism response and mails it directly to Gwen Gassaway. Gassaway gives this letter to the FBI. Apparently the FBI takes no action at this time. November 22nd, of course, JFK is assassinated. November 24th, Gwen Gassaway sees Oswald's handwriting in the newspaper and thinks that it matches the handwriting of the letter she had received from a worker and had already given to the FBI. On December 7th, Harry McCormick at the newspaper informs the FBI of this matter. And on December 11th, the FBI says the a worker letter was not written in Oswald's handwriting. And that's all we have of this from the official sources. Of course, this doesn't prove anything, so I'm going on conjecture here. But if Gwen Gassaway is related to Marie Tippit, as I think is likely because of the last names, then it's possible that Tippit, or someone involved with Tippit, like Oswald, or maybe Allan Tippit, the son of J.D., one of these people may have wanted to write a letter to Gwen and maybe had somebody else do the handwriting so she wouldn't recognize their handwriting if she knew their handwriting. Or it could be, maybe she wouldn't know the handwriting of J.D., or maybe it was Oswald and the FBI lied once again. In any case, it seems to me that this would be consistent with the idea that J.D. Tippit might be involved with communism if Gassaway is a relative, and that would stimulate the desire on the part of Tippit or someone involved with Tippit to respond to this letter in the newspaper directly to their relative or their friend's relative. Now that's utter conjecture, but it's not based on nothing at all. These people, Gwen Gassaway and whoever wrote the letter to her, have a keen interest in communism, and she does have the same last name as Marie Tippit's maiden name. What I'm trying to get to here is how Tippit could have become a communist. I'm not trying to prove he was a communist because he was a relative of Gwen Gassaway. I can't even prove he was a relative of Gwen Gassaway. But I'm trying to show some kind of connection to communism through Gwen Gassaway. She is a keen anti-communist. I guess I should get to this other thing here to demonstrate that. And here we have another FBI document, ostensibly unrelated to what I've been talking about so far, but it involves Gwen G. Gassaway, yet another spelling of Gassaway. And if we look in here, we can see it's the same Gwyn Gassaway because it's the same address in Dallas, Texas. So what this is I'll read that. On 2/24/64 and 3/9/64, CSNY 4204-S, who is in a position to furnish reliable information, furnished the current mailing lists of the weekend and midweek editions of The Worker, a communist publication, respectively. The name and address of an individual on either or both of these lists is attached above. So Gwyn Gassaway is reported to be a subscriber to The Worker to the FBI. And they seem to think it's worth, they had a subscriber list, but this is the one they made the document about. So she is known to the FBI already. This is after the stuff I've covered already. Chronologically, this comes after. So they're aware of Gwyn Gassaway already, and that's probably why they singled her out in this document. And this is related to that. And they already knew this back in December of 1963. That's the date of this document. Mr. Robert W. Lee, Salt Lake City, Utah, by letter of December 23rd, 1963, advised this office he was entering a one-year subscription to The Worker. He also advised he had recently ordered some extra copies of The Worker, and when he received these copies, a letter was in the package which had apparently been mistakenly included by The Worker publishers. This letter is dated 12/4/63, is signed by the subject, and the subject here is Gwyn Gassaway. The letter is enclosed. So apparently, it has come to the attention of the FBI that Gwyn Gassaway is a subscriber to The Worker because mistakenly a letter of hers to The Worker had been sent out to this other guy who was a subscriber to The Worker or who ordered extra copies of The Worker. So this is a very weird, random, and apparently coincidental occurrence. That is, this person, Gwyn Gassaway, that the FBI does already have an interest in, comes to their attention through a completely different source, through some kind of accidental inclusion of her letter by The Worker to some other subscriber. And we do have a photocopy of that letter by Gwyn Gassaway. Enclosed is $2. I should like an extra copy of the November 26th Worker and the December 2nd issue. They are part of history, and I'd like to have them for a scrapbook. Sincerely, Gwyn G. Gassaway, Dallas, Texas. So Gwyn is ordering extra copies, assassination copies, essentially, of The Worker, which I think displays her keen interest in communism. And yet, apparently, she's anti-communist. So she is so anti-communist that she wants copies of The Worker. And I think that means she's a keen anti-communist. And as I've covered up before already, she's somebody who calls the FBI when she gets a letter from someone who's a communist. So she's keenly interested in communism, and she's the kind of person who's going to report anything that happens to the FBI. Find a Grave has some biographical information on Gwyn Greer Gassaway. I couldn't find a connection to William Greer, the shooter or one of the shooters of JFK, but it's interesting that she has that name in her names. According to this, she was married to Andrew Jackson Post Jr. That sounds like a rich guy. September 5th, 1946, in Riverside, Connecticut. She married Robert Louis Chandler. Sounds like another rich guy. June 3rd, 1950, in Dallas. Robert Louis Chandler, I think that means he was in the Air Force. Is that what that means? I don't know what that means. But anyway, she married Bob J. Gassaway on December 30th, 1960. Her husband, Bob Gene Gassaway, died March 15th, 1962, in a crash of the Pacific of Flying Tiger Line Flight 7815-13 or /13, operating as military air transport service. Charter Flight 739/14 originated at Travis Air Force Base, with refueling stops at Honolulu, Wake Island, Guam, Clark Air Force Base, and was to terminate at Saigon. That's in Vietnam. And apparently the Dallas Morning News published a death notice of her husband. Wife of flyer lives here. The co-pilot of the Flying Tiger plane missing in the Pacific on a flight from Guam to Manila is the husband of a Dallas woman. Robert Gassaway, 38, was married about a year ago to the former Mrs. Gwynne Chandler. Mrs. Gassaway is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George J. Greer. So our Gwynne Gassaway was the wife of the co-pilot of this airplane that crashed in the Pacific on the way to Saigon. I had never heard about this airplane disaster, but it was a big story when it happened back in 1962. So I'm going to read a bit about it from the Wikipedia entry on this. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 was a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation propliner that disappeared on March 16, 1962, over the western Pacific Ocean. The aircraft, which had been chartered by the United States Army, was transporting 96 military passengers from Travis Air Force Base in California to Tan Son Nhut International Airport in Saigon, South Vietnam. After refueling at Andersen Air Base in Guam, the Super Constellation disappeared while en route to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. All 107 aboard were declared missing and presumed dead. The airliner's disappearance prompted one of the largest air and sea searches in the history of the Pacific. Aircraft and surface ships from 4 branches of the U.S. military searched more than 144,000 square miles during the course of 8 days. A civilian tanker observed what appeared to be an in-flight explosion, believed to be the missing Super Constellation, though no trace of wreckage or debris was ever recovered. The Civil Aeronautics Board determined that based on the tanker's observations, Flight 739 probably exploded in flight, though an exact cause could not be determined without examining the remnants of the aircraft. This was the deadliest single aircraft aviation accident involving the Super Constellation. The accident aircraft was a 5-year-old Lockheed 1049H Super Constellation with 17,224 airframe hours. It carried 11 American civilian crew members and 96 military passengers. The flight was operated by the Flying Tiger Line as Military Air Transport Service Flight 739, chartered by the United States Army. The Super Constellation carried 93 Ranger-trained Army communications specialists en route to South Vietnam. Now, for those of you who may not know, there was a war going on in Vietnam, and the North were communists, and the South was being supported by the United States. So these Army personnel were on their way to go fight the commies. And if you were a commie, you would be against these troops going there. And you might have an interest in seeing this plane blow up. So I think there's a possibility, based on what little knowledge I have, and you have most of the knowledge I have already, that this was sabotaged by communists in order to help the war effort for the communists in North Vietnam. That's my conjecture. Their orders were to relieve soldiers in Saigon who had been training South Vietnamese troops in flight to fight Viet Cong guerrillas. Also on board were 3 members of the South Vietnamese military. The flight crew consisted of 11 civilians based out of California, including 7 men under the command of Captain Gregory P. Thomas. The flight arrived at Guam at 11:14 on March 15th after being delayed for minor maintenance on engines numbers 1 and 3 at Honolulu and later at Wake Island. The aircraft departed from Guam at 12:57 with an estimated time of arrival at the Philippines at 1600 hours. So that would be 7 hours later. The Super Constellation carried 9 hours worth of fuel for the 8-hour flight of 1,600 miles. 80 minutes after departure, at 14:22, the captain radioed a routine message and gave his position as being 280 nautical miles west of Guam at those coordinates. The aircraft was expected to reach those coordinates at 1530. At that time, the Guam IFSS experienced temporary communication difficulties with heavy radio static. At 1539, the Guam radio operator attempted to contact Flight 739 for a position report, but was unable to establish contact. The aircraft was not seen or heard from again. Possibility of sabotage. A Liberian tanker, the SSTL Linzen, reported seeing a bright light in the sky near the aircraft's expected position about 90 minutes after the last radio contact. U.S. military officials described it as being a bright light strong enough to light a ship's decks. It was reported that the tanker observed a flash of light approximately 500 miles west of Guam, followed immediately by 2 red lights falling to the ocean at different speeds. A Civil Aeronautics Board investigation determined that crewmen aboard the tanker also observed what appeared to be vapor trails and observed the 2 fireballs fall into the ocean. The tanker proceeded to the location where the fireballs had been observed to fall into the ocean, but was unable to find any trace of the falling objects during their 6-hour search. A spokesman at the rescue effort command post in Guam said that as time passed with no sign of the aircraft, more credence is given to the possibility that the tanker may have seen the missing aircraft explode in flight. Officials with the Flying Tiger Line said that their earlier theories of sabotage would be bolstered were the investigation to reveal that an explosion had occurred. The executive vice president of operations said that experts considered it impossible for explosions to occur on the Super Constellation in the course of normal operation. Additionally, he claimed that there was nothing powerful enough aboard the aircraft to completely blow it apart, and that something violent must have happened. The CAB determined that, given the observations of the tanker crew, the flight most likely exploded in midair. As no part of the wreckage was ever found, the agency was unable to establish a determination of cause. The accident report concluded, "A summation of all relevant factors tends to indicate that the aircraft was destroyed in flight. However, due to lack of any substantiating evidence, the board is unable to state with any degree of certainty the exact fate of N6921C." And now I'm going to read a little bit from the accident report. It arrived in Guam at 11:14 hours after a routine flight of approximately 6 hours. During the ground time of 1 hour and 33 minutes, the aircraft was serviced to a total of etc. My point here is that it was on the ground for 1 hour and 33 minutes prior to its last takeoff. So it's possible that sabotage could have been done during that time. And there's another excerpt. It was established upon interrogation of 5 of the crew members, and this is crew members of the ship that witnessed the explosion in the sky, that shipboard lookouts had observed a mid-air explosion at the approximate position and time when N6921C was expected to reach 14 degrees north and 135 degrees east. It was recalled that a vapor trail, or some phenomenon resembling a vapor trail, was first observed overhead and slightly to the north of the tanker and moving in an east to west direction. The Lenzen, that's the name of that ship they're on, was cruising on a heading of 77 degrees at this time. As this vapor trail passed behind a cloud, there occurred an explosion which was described by the witnesses as intensely luminous, with a white nucleus surrounded by a reddish-orange periphery with radial lines of identically colored light. The explosion occurred in 2 pulses lasting between 2 and 3 seconds, and from it 2 flaming objects of unequal brightness and size apparently fell at disparate speeds into the sea. During the last 10 seconds of the fall of the slower of the 2 objects, a small bright target was observed on the ship's radar, bearing 270 degrees, range 17 miles. Well, I'm no expert in anything, but this sounds like they're saying that there's evidence that some aircraft shot down this airplane. That's what that sounds like to me. And then another excerpt here. Second Officer Robbie J. Gassaway. Here we have yet another spelling of this last name. And I find this to be very strange because it's in an official document, and they are spelling this name wrong. And I don't think it's just a typo, because this name appears this way twice in this document, both times as Gassaway. Robbie J. Gassaway, age 39, was employed by the Flying Targo Line, Incorporated, on January 7, 1953. He held a valid airline transport pilot certificate with a 1049H rating. Second Officer Gassaway, or it appears 3 times in this document, typed that way, had a total of 5,500 flying hours, of which 900 were in 1049H aircraft. He had flown approximately 139 hours in the last 90 days. His first-class medical certificate, with no limitations, was dated June 12, 1961. Now I want to stop here and just review the variable spellings of this name here. J.D. Tippit's wife is said to be, her maiden name was said to be Marie Gassaway, and it's actually Gassaway. The person I'm calling the anti-communist FBI informant, Gwyn Gassaway, is also spelled Gassaway, and her husband, the airline co-pilot in this airplane disaster, his name is Robbie Gassaway. Apparently that's his real name, but his name is misspelled as Gassaway in the crash report. So I'm willing to accept that a name like Gassaway will have multiple spellings that have innocent explanations, but I think there's an odd consistency here where everybody's name gets spelled different ways. That seems a little strange to me, and this is something I've noticed in FBI documents where the FBI will intentionally misspell a name. That's my conclusion, in order to make it difficult to connect facts in the case. So in my mind, I'm seeing that sort of thing going on here. That is, perhaps somebody doesn't want us to realize that the airline co-pilot is married to the anti-communist FBI informant. I think that's the most suspicious misspelling here. That is, Robbie Gassaway's name is spelled Gassaway in the official government document. So my theory here is that someone in the government doesn't want people realizing that the co-pilot on the airplane that blew up in flight was married to an anti-communist FBI informant, because then somebody might think that this airline accident has something to do with communists. Now, you might think that's counterintuitive in the Cold War, that is, that the people in the government wouldn't want to hide that if it were true, but I think this would be very embarrassing to the U.S. government if one of their military chartered flights had been successfully sabotaged by commies. That would be a loss in the Cold War, and countries like to hide their losses in wars, be they cold or be they hot. So I think that's what's going on here. I think that somebody in the government influenced the crash report, the accident report, in order to have the name misspelled so it wouldn't be easy to connect Robbie Gassaway to Gwyn Gassaway, because Gwyn Gassaway is an FBI informant. The idea being that perhaps Gwyn married Robbie because U.S. intelligence knew that Robbie was a commie, and Gwyn is a mole, or an undercover agent marrying a commie, so that the government will know what this commie is up to. That's what I suspect. And going back to the Gwyn Gassaway Find a Grave biography, she was married to Andrew Jackson Post Jr., September 5th, 1946, in Riverside, Connecticut. I think that's very likely an upper class marriage. The name sounds like he's a rich heir, and Riverside, Connecticut is a fancy sort of area where lots of rich people live. So I think this means that Gwyn is in the ruling class originally. And I don't know why that marriage ended, but she married somebody else here who has that AAF there. As I suspected, AAF apparently indicates a World War II era Air Force person. So I think she's a ruling class person who had been married before to a pilot, probably. And she might have come to the attention of some intelligence person because they come from the ruling class, the upper echelon types like Allen Dulles, for example, and George Herbert Walker Bush, for example. I have no evidence that any of them knew Gwyn Chandler or Gwyn Gassaway or whatever name we want to use for her, but I think this doesn't prove anything, but it shows a possible explanation for things here, that she was a ruling class person who had been married to an Air Force pilot, and if in the LLB there for Chandler, some kind of a law degree, so she might have been known to an intelligence person who thought she could be useful in catching this commie Robbie Gassaway, and I suspect that she married Gassaway as part of an intelligence operation. That's my suspicion. So I suspect that Robbie Gassaway was a communist agent who helped to destroy the aircraft that he was co-piloting. Now, this is from the accident report, and I underlined ground time of 1 hour and 33 minutes because one of the possibilities, I imagine, is that Robbie Gassaway could have got off the airplane when it was in Guam, and he had 1 hour and 33 minutes to do that. I would think the accident report would mention that if it had happened. That is, if the co-pilot had left the flight, it should be in the accident report, and it is not. So I view this as a possibility, but I think it's unlikely because I would think something like that would have to be in the accident report. But I still think it's a possibility. That is, if he's going to destroy the airplane that he's co-piloting, he might rather not be on the plane when it gets destroyed, because suicide missions are not very pleasant. I imagine. I've never been on one, other than life itself. Another possibility is that Robbie Gassaway was a commie who was willing to go on a suicide mission. One can only speculate about these things, and I'm doing a lot of that in this video, I realize. But his infant child, with Gwyn Gassaway, had died in 1961, about 6 months before the crash. Robert Greer Gassaway was born on month day. Oh, that's apparently they don't have that there. 1961 in Texas, to Bobby Jean Gassaway and Gay Gwyn Gassaway. Robert passed away in 1961 at age less than 1 year. So he could have been despondent about the death of his infant son that was named after him. And I don't know how the marriage was going, but all indications I found were that Robbie Gassaway was living in California at this time, while his wife was living in Texas. So it might be that the marriage wasn't doing too well either. It was her third marriage, and in my hypothesis here, she didn't marry him for love. She married him because she's an intelligence agent. So that might make for an unpleasant marriage, and the death of the infant son might make one despondent. And so maybe Robbie was willing to go on a suicide mission. I don't know. I can only speculate. So the idea that I'm having here is that Robbie Gassaway is related to J.D. Tippit through the in-laws, and that he's a communist, and that J.D. Tippit, became a communist through his association with Robbie Gassaway. And I know I can't prove any of that, but I'm just trying to explain how J.D. Tippit might have become a communist. And I want to come back to this point before I leave the matter of this airplane crash. According to Wikipedia, the Super Constellation carried 93 Ranger-trained Army communications specialists en route to South Vietnam. I view this as possibly significant because Carl Mather, whose license plate was seen on a car driven by Oswald in the vicinity of the alleged location of the Tippit murder, Carl Mather worked for Collins Radio and installed specialized communications equipment, or electronic gear, it says there, but because he works for Collins Radio, it's probably communications equipment. And this is the same kind of thing these 93 Ranger soldiers did. So it could very well be that Carl Mather knew some of these people, and that might provide some motivation to him to cooperate in some kind of an operation that was going to set up J.D. Tippit. If he had been told that J.D. Tippit was involved with the commie who arranged for the deaths of his presumed friends, then that might have motivated him to cooperate in an operation that would do in Tippit. Now, as I said, the indications are that Robbie Gassaway was living in California at the time of the airplane disaster, and I based that mostly on this. I didn't actually pay any money to get to see the article here, but it says in the Google search result for the Oxnard Press Courier Archives that Gassaway was of Fillmore. Fillmore is a location in California, not Texas, or at least I think it's pretty obvious that this California newspaper would be referring to Fillmore, California. However, according to the 1961 Dallas Directory, Robbie Gassaway was living in Dallas in 1961 on Cedar Springs Road. And I think this would be necessary. That is, I would think for Gassaway to influence J.D. Tippit to become a communist, it would have to be through personal contact. They wouldn't be doing this over the telephone or through letters, I don't think. Not during the Cold War. That would be noticed by the FBI, probably. So, here is the possibility. We have evidence that Robbie Gassaway, who I think was a communist agent, was living in Dallas, Texas, at the same time that J.D. Tippit was, prior to the Kennedy assassination. And interestingly, in the directory it says that Robbie Gassaway works for Lone Star Airline, Incorporated. Presumably this information would come from Gassaway. How else would they get that information? And I was unable to find any other reference to Lone Star Airline in Texas operating at this time. There was a Lone Star Airline later on, and I think it was in the 90s. But I couldn't find anything in the 60s. It's only this reference here in the directory saying that Gassaway worked for them. This entry and one other entry for somebody else. According to the same directory, the 1961 directory, an Anita F. Walker also worked for Lone Star Airlines. Of course, General Walker is a person in the Kennedy story, but Walker's a very common last name, and I couldn't find any reason to think that Anita had anything to do with General Edwin Walker. But these are the only two references to Lone Star Airlines that I could ever find to a Lone Star Airlines that operated in the 1960s in Texas. And both of them live on Cedar Springs Road in apartments very near each other. So it's a little strange, but I don't know if it really means anything. I couldn't prove anything at all about it. And what makes it a little stranger, I think, is that the accident report said that Robbie Gassaway worked with Target Airlines, or he was employed by Flying Target Line, Incorporated, on January 7th, 1953. That implies that he was working for the Flying Target Line, Incorporated, from 1953 until he died in 1962. It doesn't say that literally, explicitly, but it implies that. But if he was employed by Flying Target Line in 53, then why is he saying that he works for this Lone Star Airlines in 61? It could be that he didn't have continuous employment for Flying Target Line. I don't know. It's unexplained. But I think there's a possibility that Robbie Gassaway, being a communist agent, maybe told the directory people that he worked for some kind of airline that didn't even exist. And it could be this other person that also works for this airline that doesn't exist might have told them the same thing for the same reason. But I don't know. So even though this is all very sketchy, this explanation for how Tippit could have become a communist, I think the evidence referenced earlier in the video implies a reasonable conclusion that he was a communist, that he was involved with Oswald and his son as communists. And I think there's reason to think that they were involved in a Cuban plot to kill Kennedy. And this video was about saying how Tippit could possibly have become a communist, and I think he could possibly have been related through marriage to Robbie Gassaway, and that Robbie Gassaway might have been a communist agent, and that the FBI and American intelligence knew all about, but never told us. It's possible.